I want to our NJPACT Real webinar. First, I'd like to apologize to any of you who popped into the meeting this morning. And I also want to mention that we are recording this, but I want to apologize to anyone who popped into the meeting this morning. A few folks had let us know that we had scheduled this and Thursday's meeting at the same time as the Energy Master Plan hearing, which was a faux pas. In order to accommodate people who wanted to attend both, we adjusted the schedule and sent out notice, but I regret that any inconvenience that it caused you. You're here now, and I am thankful for that. So after 4 long years and many stakeholder meetings, we have filed the real rule. You will hear from Vince Mazzei, our New Jersey State Floodplain Administrator, today on the particulars and the details regarding the next steps in the rule process. And I want to sincerely thank you for all of your input and your patience. Rulemaking is not for the faint of heart. I am proud to say that this proposal, in addition to your valuable feedback, is based on the best available science, which you will hear about today. And I think I speak on behalf of Vince and I when I say that we wish there was something that we could put in this rule proposal that could change the real facts. The fact that our seas are rising, our storms are becoming more frequent, and that there is a growing sense in the scientific community that we are not on target for moderate emissions reductions, which is what this rule asks applicants and communities to plan for. Predictive climate science continues to evolve, but the clear trend is that such predictions are getting more dire, not less. And our job here at DEP is to protect our communities today and into the future by informing and helping them prepare for climate risks. Things are changing, and we know that they're going to continue to change. So I'm going to borrow a term that I heard on the Harvard Business School's podcast, Climate Rising. The term is stability assumption. It's the idea that over our history, we have generally been able to assume that our climate would behave as it always has. And it's therefore embedded in our codes and our standards. But we now know that we can no longer assume stability. The river, the ocean, the weather, it's not going to act as it always has. And the responsible reaction then is to plan and to invest wisely in resilience using the best available data to adapt. And that is precisely what these rules do. So thank you for being here. I want to thank my team for taking their mandate to protect New Jersey so seriously. And let's hear from Vince.
Thank you, Katie. All right, let's share my screen. And Katie, could you verify that you can see my screen?
I can.
Okay, excellent. All right, thank you. So we have had many other webinars and meetings about this rulemaking, and so it's my pleasure to start this series of deeper dives. And this is the first webinar of 4, and I'll explain what the sequence of them are. But in this particular webinar, we're going to look at the sea level rise science a bit. We're going to look at the implications along the coastline, what that means for development, what that means for our regulatory areas. And we're going to specifically focus on the inundation risk zone, which is that land that is above sea level today, but at some point in the future will be underwater. Literally underwater all the time or twice a day during high tides. So we're not talking about just the flooding aspect of it during a hurricane, but the actual encroachment of the sea onto the land and what that means for us. So quick overview, we have been working on this rulemaking since Governor Murphy's 2020 executive order that set DEP on a path to looking at our land use regulations and seeing how they need to be adjusted and adapted to address sea level rise. As Katie said, we would love to be able to not have that happen in some capacity in this rulemaking, but what this rulemaking does is it responds to the science and says, what's the responsible way that development should proceed along our coastline in light of this science? So we've had dozens of stakeholder sessions since 2020. We've met with industry groups, federal, state, and local government agencies, environmental groups, insurance and investment agencies. And the proposal that we developed focuses mainly on our 4 land use rules: flood hazard, stormwater, CZM, and wetlands. But we also open up all other DEP rules that reference flooding. So as you can imagine, many of our rules have some focus on what flooding might do to a development of one kind or another. So our site remediation rules, our green acres, forestry, all these things that point to flooding, the terminology needed to be amended. And the overarching purpose of it all is to address the impacts of sea level rise and to improve our land and water resource protection accordingly. So first, a little bit about the rulemaking schedule. As Katie mentioned, we filed our proposal with Office of Administrative Law on March 2nd, and on May 2nd, and a courtesy copy was posted on the DEP webpage last week. This week and next, we will have a series of 4 webinars. This is the first session. We'll be covering environmental enhancements on Wednesday, coastal climate protection on Thursday, and then the following Wednesday after Memorial Day, we'll cover stormwater. We anticipate that the proposal that we filed will be published in the New Jersey Register as an official proposal in July. Office of Administrative Law is currently reviewing what we filed. We anticipate 3 public hearings and a 90-day comment period. So people will have the rule for at least 2 months before it's published, and then we'll have the rule for another 3 months after it's published. So there'll be 5 months that folks can review and comment on this rule. And we're anticipating an adoption date of sometime mid next year. So the way that it works is that if we file a proposal and it's published in the register, let's say it's published July 1st. Well, that means we have until July 1st of next year to file the adoption document. And the adoption documents could take some time to process, so it could be adopted somewhat after that. But our target is to have this this time next year. So the scope of the rulemaking, the new standards will apply only to new development, redevelopment, and substantial improvements to buildings. Now, that might seem obvious, but there's been some concern that we would be focusing on existing development and forcing people to elevate or doing some things that what was not related to development activities. And so our regulations focus on development and redevelopment, and one type of redevelopment is a substantial improvement to buildings. So it doesn't affect existing development unless someone proposes something. It does not create any no-build zones, so there's no prohibitions in this rule. And it doesn't require roads and buildings to be elevated when doing so isn't practicable. There are a lot of factors that go into that, and we're going to talk about that today. The NJPACT real reform is broken up into 7 major themes, and we're going to cover 2 of them today. The first 2, protecting against chronic inundation, sea level rise, and flood damage. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that helps, our regulatory rubric helps protect critical facilities and infrastructure. Protecting land and water resources we'll cover on Wednesday. Stormwater we'll cover next week. And some of the other things related to the coastal rules we'll be covering later this week, as I mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about the underlying science. So you've probably seen from prior webinars or publications that we've had. This is from Rutgers University Science and Technical Advisory Panel report in 2019. And what it does is it sets out the probability or the chance that sea level rise will exceed certain heights based on different emissions, low, medium, moderate, and high emissions levels, and also different planning horizons, 2030, 50, 70, 2100, and 2150. And so our first decision was to decide what planning horizon to use. And we focused on the year 2100 because that's 76 years away, 75 years away after adoption. And roads and buildings and bridges will likely still be serviceable in some capacity by the year 2100. And so we want to make sure that what's built today will last and will be as safe as possible by the end of the century. So the next thing was we focused on our moderate emissions levels, and that's an unknown because many scientists believe that we're not going to meet that moderate emissions level because of the global impacts. So it could be higher than this, but there's a likely range, assuming moderate emissions, that we would have between 2 and 5.1 feet of sea level rise. So initially, we looked at what we would call the median chance and say there's a 50% chance that sea level rise will increase by at least 3.3 feet. And that seemed like a good starting point, but when you think about that, that's really a flip of a coin. That's really saying that there's a 50% chance that if we have structures that are built 3.3 feet higher or flood-proofed higher, that there would only be a 50% chance that that would be enough. And what keeps us up at night is making sure is worrying that are we doing everything that we can to protect the people. And so taking the high end of the likely range, there's a 5.1%, there's a 17% chance that sea level rise will exceed 5.1 feet by the end of the century. And so that's the number that we've used, and we'll say 5 feet. We'll round it to 5 feet. You can see the report if you click on the link in the bottom there. And a little bit about this report. The report was authored by a large panel with collective expertise that was really unparalleled. There were 19 authors, and they represented research universities, federal institutions, professional associations, and consulting firms. And here's just a list of a few of the agencies and groups that participated in this. And the data from the 2019 staff report builds on the report that came out in 2016 by the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance. And that was focused a lot on Professor Kopp's 2014 peer-reviewed published work. So the underlying data from the 2016 and 2019 reports are peer-reviewed as based on peer-reviewed material. And you can see here's a link or some lists of some of the material that was used for the 2019 report, especially with regard to the acceleration from the melting of the polar ice caps. So what does that mean if we have 5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century? Well, as sea levels rise, that means more land either regularly or permanently will be inundated. And that is depicted by that blue area, which we're going to examine more closely. But higher inundation, higher sea level rise means more inundation. It means higher flood elevations. If the sea level is going up 5 feet, that means that flood elevations are going up by at least 5 feet. And higher flood elevations mean more recurring flood damage further inland. And the problem that we face is that our existing flood standards are based on sometimes outdated historical trends that don't account for sea level rise and attendant storm surge. So mapping is great, but it's a snapshot in time, and it says this is what, based on the data that we've collected so far, we expect will happen. But as Katie mentioned, we don't live we don't have a climate that is not changing anymore. We can't look at stationarity anymore. So roads and buildings built today are likely to be serviceable in 2100, as I mentioned. And so reliance on incomplete or inaccurate data leads to inadequate risk assessment. It leads to increased damage to public infrastructure, to greater flood losses and greater losses of life. So let's talk about the inundation risk zone and how you figure out where it is. That's the first place to start is, well, where is this area? And there's two options. And there are a lot of things in our regulations that are set up this way where you have a sort of an easier option based on mapping or some other source, or the ability for you to provide better data or more site-specific data for your project. So the two options are you can use DEP's online mapping tool, which I'll walk through. That's on our GeoWeb application. Or you can compute it. You can compute the actual limit of the inundation risk zone on a site by using site-specific topography and data from NOAA. And that's based on the mean higher high water elevation. And the method is outlined in the flood hazard rules in section 3.4C. So if you look at DEP's GIS system, I have a bunch of screenshots that will show you how to figure out where the inundation risk zone would be in different places. So you open up the tool based on that link and you launch GeoWeb, and you get a map of New Jersey. And so in the top left corner, you can add in an address, or you can just zoom in. And I just zoomed in. And so this is an area around Highlands by Sandy Hook. And the next thing I did was I opened up the base maps, and I like to use imagery. So here's the imagery of that area. So this is an aerial imagery. And then in the top right corner, and you can, I'm sorry, I think I was muted by accident. So you can see the layers in the top right corner. And if you expand that down, you can see that there's one layer for water. And if you expand that, you have a whole suite of information that you can apply to a given area. And one of those things near the bottom you can see is sea level rise. And not only is there 5 feet, but you can see 3 feet and 2 feet as well, because it's a useful tool for people and communities to look at how resilient their communities are, figure out what areas are most vulnerable to sea level rise. So if you click on, in this case, the 5 feet of sea level rise, everything that's in blue or light blue or almost white is underwater if you have a 5 foot of sea level rise. So you can see Highlands there, which is the town in this upper area here, that is almost completely underwater. And that means all the time or twice a day during high tide. Now let's zoom in a little bit so that you can see more site-specific data. If you zoom in on this area, you can see the lot and blocks that are affected. And this is that overlay of the sea level rise of 5 feet. So you can see, if you zoomed in, you could see each lot, how it would be impacted on that lot. And so you could take that line and transcribe it right on your plan if you wanted to, or you could use site-specific data like I'll explain. Here's another spot. This is by Seabright, and this shows you what 5 feet of sea level rise would do to that area. You can see like the oceanfront area is not affected quite as much because of the topography, but the Back Bay areas and all the areas around, you know, on the bay side are severely impacted in some cases. So I've broken this up into 7 sections because I know that there'll be a lot of questions on each. And so I want to take a minute or two to see if anyone has any questions based on what we've covered so far. And you can either raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. And you'll have time later to ask questions if you haven't thought of one yet. Yes, Ray. Ray, I think you had your hand up. And I think you're muted, sir.
Sorry, I didn't know that you called me. Just a quick question about the science. I don't want to have a long conversation right now. But you didn't mention, you mentioned the 2019 Rutgers staff report, but you don't mention the update that COP did in 23. Is there a reason why the 23 report is not referenced in the rule?
So Ray, we are in constant contact with Dr. Kopp to make sure that nothing has changed. And we did speak with him regarding that. And I don't know if we have Dr. Procopio on the line. I think he was the one who had that contact. But at this point, there was nothing to be updated in that regard. Nick, anything to add to that? You're muted, friend.
We will figure all this out someday. Thank you, Katie. No, right. Keep in contact with COP, trying to make sure that we stay up on top of the science. We did have that reach out, and as you said, Mr. Kenter, we are aware of it and feel comfortable with where the science still stands in the 2019 stuff.
Okay, but I thought that Dr. Kopp had basically said that the confidence that there'll be a ice sheet collapse in the Western Arctic is no longer likely, that it's unlikely, and that the IPCC and everyone else are basically excluding that from their assumptions. And I thought that COP had also recently said in the report to DEP that you would only use 5 feet if you were really risk adverse and only for more critical infrastructure, not for everything. Am I mistaken in his opinions?
You are. There is no consensus among scientists that it is unlikely. I think that Dr. Kopp has a really good FAQ document that you should consult to understand terms like low confidence, which means they don't have a lot of data. It does not mean in the vernacular as you and I would use it, low confidence that it's not going to happen. So I think, I would refer you to Dr. Kopp's FAQ document to learn more about that. And what was your second point, Ray? What was your second observation?
I think the IPCC.
Well,
IPCC.
I mean, again, I thought that Dr. Kopp, again, and I have all his FAQs and everything else that he said and his updated report, and I had thought that his conclusion that an entity would only use a 5 foot assumption if they
yeah.
were really risk adverse and should be applied more toward high sensitivity infrastructure. I'm using the wrong term there, but critical infrastructure,
Right.
not to everything.
Yeah, I mean, as I said from the top of the hour, the science does continue to evolve, and as Vince went over, we are not content to leave our investment at the Jersey Shore to the flip of a coin. 50-50 is not an investment choice that I think folks would want to make. And as I noted, the science continues to evolve, and none of it is getting rosier. So as we heard from the commissioner last week, we are more concerned that 5 is not enough than we are that 5 is too much. And we have another hand.
And actually, before we go on to that, I just wanted to point out that the way that the rule is structured is what we're focusing on today, obviously. And, you know, I appreciate the questions, right? But whether it's 5 feet or some other number, it's the same thing that you'll see. So all the things that we'll talk about here today cover the implications of the rule from a higher flood elevation resulting from sea level rise. And I'm not sure who has their hand up next. I think maybe Caitlin.
Might have been David Pringle.
Sure.
All right. So, unlike Ray, I'm not willing to take our chances with climate catastrophe, and I would like New Jersey to do its part in both in terms of mitigation and resiliency. I'm representing Empower New Jersey this afternoon, and I have 2 questions. One is, unless I'm missing something, under the Administrative Procedures Act, this is a unusual, and I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but it's different than the past process where you're putting forward a month before you even submit it to the register for it to appear a month later. So, you know, normally you propose, you know, once it's proposed to the register, you put it forward and you always have the disclaimer that, you know, this isn't the official thing, the register is the official thing. So I would appreciate, again, I think there's some good things and some bad things potentially about that, but I'd be interested in hearing DEP's thinking about why, you know, am I right that you're doing this process differently than in the past, and what are the pros and cons in terms of public process and maybe legal vulnerabilities, number 1. And number 2, and then I'll be quiet for once. All of this could have been proposed 4 years ago. Governor signed an executive order 4 years ago to do all of this 2 years ago. And I know I give you and a lot of my colleagues and advocates give DEP a hard time, and Katie and Vince and others, I'm looking at you particularly. I'm sorry, but it's not enough. It's not fast enough. And it's now getting proposed. So under the timeline you just laid out, best case scenario, it gets adopted in year 7.5 of a year of year 8 administration. So you're leaving it up to the next gal or guy. So, you know, give me some confidence to have some belief.
Thanks, Dave. Certainly, we understand that everyone has a different perspective, and we kind of rely on you all for that. So no apologies there for beating us up when you feel you need to. This is a model we used with the inland flood protection rule and that we heard good feedback on. So you are correct that this is not necessarily our usual, but we did do it with IFPR. We held these sessions, and as far as the timing and the length of time that it's taken, you know, these things require thoughts, a thoughtful process, and I think we're all feeling, most of us are feeling an urgency with respect to climate change. So I can certainly appreciate that. We would love for all of this to go faster, but we stand on where we are today, and we're looking ahead, onward. And I think Kayleen, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, was next.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's just so you know, Vince, you can see who raised their hand in order by looking at the people. So like have the hand with the numbers.
I see.
Yep. Thought it might be helpful.
New Teams feature.
Yeah.
Kayleen Koch from New Jersey EDA. I just had two kind of question. My team's really interested in how you're going to define what are the instances that would be impracticable. We just didn't see that kind of definition. So if you could help define that a little more, that would be helpful. And then the layers that you showed on DEP's online mapping tool.
Oh, you seem to have muted yourself.
I don't know what happened there. Someone unmuted me or muted me, I think. I don't know. So the mapping tool that you showed us earlier, is it possible to download the sea level rise layers that you use there?
Mm-hmm.
And where do we download
Caitlin,
that?
did you say you were with EDA?
That's correct.
Okay, so I've got an email from your director, and we are going to do a private tutorial for the agencies. So not to worry about that meeting. But Vince, why don't you talk a little bit about practicable, which is a very hard term to define. I don't want to liken it to something else the courts tried to define in this space, but it is sort of you see it when you know it kind of thing. But Vince, you could maybe perhaps give some of the considerations that we give generally.
Absolutely, and that's a great segue into some of the other sections of this presentation, because we do go through different scenarios of like when it's practicable, when it isn't practicable, the things that we look at. So we'll talk about that in great detail. But you know, I think the underlying theme that you want to always keep in mind with all of these rules that we're presenting today is that we're trying to find places where we can add value, and there are certain situations that lend themselves because of the scope of the project or the type of activity that's being done, that there is an opportunity now to make things safer, to make things better for folks. Sometimes there isn't, and we're going to talk about the difference between those two and like what the implications are going forward.
Vince, we've got another hand. Dave, I assume that your hand is still up from before, and I'm going to Brad Bachta. I hope I'm saying your name right, sir.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question, and I know this just came out last week, and I scanned the document, and I saw the 5 feet mentioned, and I remember from the Floodplain Managers Convention talking to Vince and hearing a lot about this. Is effectively this document seeking to change the 1 foot freeboard established after Sandy to 5 feet, or is that not quite what it says?
Well, so, and we'll cover that as well. It's a great question, Brad. So this 5 feet that we're talking about changes our regulatory flood elevation, and we still would have that 1 foot of freeboard on top of that. So I'll show you exactly what that looks like for different scenarios going forward.
Thank you.
Great question. Sure. All right, I'm going to go to the next section then, because I want to make sure that we have time to cover all of the material. We have a lot to cover. All right, so the inundation risk zone itself, I mentioned before that you can use the mapping, but let's say that you think that the mapping is inaccurate. It doesn't, let's say, indicate where you believe that encroachment of sea level will be by year 2100. So you can use site-specific survey data, and this method is laid out in the flood hazard rules and that citation there. And the way it would work is that you would have a New Jersey licensed professional land surveyor determine the elevation of the ground at the mean high water line along the tidal waterway closest to the site. And we'll say rounded it to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. And if there's multiple elevations nearby, and I'm going to show you exactly what this looks like, then you would take the higher or the highest one of those. And so the inundation risk zone includes all land that lies within 5 feet vertically of the mean high water elevation. Now, if you're not familiar with the term mean high water, we have 2 high tides every day, and one's always a little higher than the other. And if you take the average over a long period of time of the higher of the 2, you have the mean high water elevation. And so that is a good picture of what would be inundated during high tide in most cases. So if you look at kind of a cross section of a seascape, you have your current sea level and your current shoreline. And if you add 5 feet to it, you can see that that land in between the current shoreline and the future shoreline is what we're calling the inundation risk zone. And if you were to compute that based on what is the current sea level, this is how you would do it. You'd go to the NOAA website, and and here's the link to it, and there are different datums that you can see from all different stations across the state. So if you click on New Jersey, there's a list of all the states, and you click on New Jersey, you'll see that there's about 84 different stations along our coastal areas. And you might even be able to use some of them in Pennsylvania, New York, depending on where you are. So we'll just, for conversation purposes, I just picked the Keyport station along Raritan Bay. And if you click on that, you can see this gives you some very specific data for this location. And the default of all the elevations that are given is based on mean low water, which is the exact opposite of mean high water, right? And so what you need to do is convert the datum into NAVD 88. So if you scroll down, you can see here that you can choose what datum. And so the default of mean low water, and you can pick feet or meters or whatever. So if you drop that down, you can pick NAVD 88, North American Vertical Datum of 1988, which is what we use. And then click submit, and it changes the numbers. So you can see that in the very top, the mean high water line is at elevation 2.66. So that becomes your benchmark for determining the IRZ. So if in this case, if the mean high water line is 2.66, you add 5 feet to that, the elevation of the inundation risk zone is 7.66. So any land on this property that's below elevation 7.66 would be in this inundation risk zone. So any questions about that methodology before we go into what the implications are? Mr. Loomis.
How does that work with levees?
How does that work with, in other words, if water can't get behind the levee? Is that what you mean?
Right. I see
Well,
on those maps, it shows the area, the low areas of inundation on the back, on the GeoWeb. It shows green areas, which I guess are lowland areas that wouldn't be able to drain
right.
if there's 5 feet of water. So does that create a special flood area for those spaces?
If a levee prevented the water from getting into the area, then it wouldn't be part of the inundation risk zone. But if the levee's overtopped, which is a lot of times what it would be, maybe not for the inundation risk zone purposes, but for flood elevation purposes, then the area behind the levee would still be considered to be regulatory. So it really kind of depends on the circumstances of the site to figure out whether or not it would be in or not. But you're right, on the mapping, I should have pointed out the greenish areas are areas where water is kind of trapped. They're like low-lying areas that maybe stormwater runoff gets in and they can't exit, or it could be areas behind levees as well. But that's all included within an inundation risk zone unless you can demonstrate otherwise.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I believe there was another question. Mr. Savakul.
Yes, I'm just a little confused how measuring from mean high versus the P-firm. So a P-firm elevation defining your special flood hazard area, say, could be elevation 9, but that's elevation NAVD 88. How, maybe this is yet to come, but how does this tie in now, adding 5 feet to the mean high water?
Ask and you shall receive. That is the next section that we're going to talk about after the inundation risk zone. This schematic here that you're seeing focuses only on the impact of sea level rise to permanent inundation lands, right? So it's not speaking to the flood elevation, the 1% flood or the BFE or anything like that, but that will be the next piece of this, and we'll answer your question when we get there. All right, Mr. Castillo. Anthony, Tony needs to mute yourself.
My apologies. question for you. In the Meadowlands area, I was just looking at tides and currents. I do not see any available locations where I can actually compute the IRZ for those areas down there in the Meadowlands. Do you know if this will be updated soon to include stations in this area?
Not sure what NOAA's plans are. That's an interesting thing. I'd like to talk to you about that offline because I believe that there are some there. It might, having it in map view would be easier than having a list. That's a little bit of the challenge of having a list of 84 different stations. But let's see what we can find. And either way, you would take the one that's nearest to the site. So even if it were a few miles away, that would be the one that you use. So there is always going to be one to use. It's a matter of figuring out which one is the closest to your property.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, let's go on to the next step would be, okay, now that we've defined what the inundation risk zone is, what does that look like compared to the larger coastal flood hazard area? And again, the inundation risk zone is where you have permanent standing water due to sea level rise, either all the time or twice a day during high tide, versus the coastal flood hazard area, which is the annual risk of storm-induced flooding exacerbated by sea rise. So that's the FEMA PFIRMs plus 5 feet, which we'll talk about. So that flooding retreats, but inundation does not. So in inundation risk zone, there are really 3 things. One is an assessment. If someone is proposing development in this area, it's intended to be an explanation of what the impact of sea level rise would be on that development. So it's not decisional. It's mostly for notice purposes, so people understand the risks. The second is an on-site alternatives analysis. Has there been an effort to examine all opportunities to ameliorate flood risk on this site and inundation risk on this site? So is the development on the highest portion of the site? Maybe some portions of the site can be raised up, and so on. The standards in the inundation risk zone that we're proposing only apply to residential buildings, and we'll talk about this: residential buildings, critical buildings, and critical infrastructure. And then there's an acknowledgement that there is a flood risk on this site. So when we issue a permit, or if we issue a permit for development in this area, we would have a statement on there saying that this land has been identified by the state of New Jersey as being at risk of inundation. It's in the inundation risk zone. And so that way lenders and future purchasers and future occupiers of the structure can understand what the risks are, because the more well-informed folks are about their flood risk or the risk of inundation, the better choices they can make. Now, let's contrast that with what the larger coastal flood hazard areas. There's no inundation risk assessment or alternatives analysis per se, unless the rules already require it, and we'll talk about that a bit. And there still is a risk acknowledgement, but it's a shorter form of it. So again, it's recorded in the title, and the flood hazard rules already have language related to that, and it's going to be expanded as part of this rulemaking. So the new standards apply to new, reconstructed, or improved residential buildings. There's an exception for the inundation risk zone standards for repair and maintenance activities that don't alter the building's height, footprint area, or habitable area. So the reason why we did that is because we recognize that there are different types of substantial improvements. Now, a substantial improvement to a building, if it's $1 million building, you could do $500,000 worth of improvements to that building before you would trigger substantial improvement. If you have a $60,000 building, you could do $30,000 of improvements and trigger the substantial improvement. So if you were doing just basic maintenance and repair, like replacing your roof or replacing your kitchen or your bathroom, you could easily hit that $30,000 mark. And so our idea here was that if someone were doing activities in the inundation risk zone that were of a intended to either construct something new or to expand an existing use, then that's when this would kick in. So if you have an activity that doesn't alter the building's height or the footprint area of the building or the habitable area of the building, then it just, these standards don't apply to that. Excuse me. Critical buildings, that's ASCE flood design class 3 and 4 buildings. That includes everything from schools, fire and police stations, medical facilities, correctional facilities, power generating stations, critical aviation facilities, basically anything where people will be congregated and maybe trapped during a flood, or which types of buildings are critical for a community's recovering after a flood. So, police and fire stations, evacuation routes, things like that. And then critical infrastructure is that infrastructure that's necessary for emergency response and recovery during and after a flood. So it's similar to the critical buildings. And so the standards in the inundation risk zone only apply to these three categories. There's an exception with the roadways for drainage improvements and associated stormwater management structures that are necessary to ameliorate periodic inundation along a roadway. So if a municipality is just putting in some drainage to, putting in some new inlets or something like that, there's no opportunity now to raise the road or improve the road. So that would be an exception. Safety or state of good repair improvements to the roadways, same thing. And any project that is proposed by a public transportation entity, so that's any government entity, or the Turnpike or New Jersey Transit, that reached a milestone as to development and design prior to the adoption date. So the way, if you look at the inland, if you look at the current regulations that we adopted last year, you can see language in there that says when a public transportation entity reaches that milestone, it locks them into the rules that are in place at that time. So kind of even a deeper dive, what do applicants in the inundation risk zone need to show us? One, we need to have a good picture of how serious the permanent or daily inundation is. We need to know the mean high or high water elevation nearest the site, the minimum amount of inundation that would cause the lowest portions of the site to be inundated. So we want to know, are we talking 6 inches? Are we talking 5 feet, right? And where the project involves construction or improvements to a building, the minimum amount of inundation that would cause the lowest portion of the roadway providing access to the site to be inundated. So you could have a situation where you have a building that's just marginally in the inundation risk zone, but the road going to that building is several feet below that, which is not uncommon. So you would have to disclose that information. The second thing is that you would prepare an inundation risk assessment that analyzes the potential adverse impacts of inundation on the site. So, okay, now that we know how much water, what's going to happen when that water hits? What kind of injury or loss of life? What is anticipated to happen here? If you have 6 inches of flooding of inundation, perhaps you can raise up the ground 6 inches and address it that way. If it's 5 feet, you're not going to be able to do that in a lot of cases. What kind of damage or loss of use of the building or infrastructure due to the inundation might occur, including disruption of public transportation, government services. It's basically an idea of like what's going to happen when this thing is underwater, and what are the increases in short and long-term costs due to inundation. And a lot of this exercise is to make sure that people understand what they're getting involved with if they're developing in this area. Now, we did a GIS exercise of the inundation risk zone, and about 94% of the land in the inundation risk zone was either developed already or was encumbered by something that would make development difficult, like coastal wetlands or other encumbrances. So what we generally believe we will see in the inundation risk zone is redevelopment activities. And so there's generally going to be an opportunity then to ameliorate some of the inundation damage that could happen. And then the third thing is demonstrate the use of all reasonable measures for accomplishing the basic purpose of the project in a manner that is likely to avoid or substantially reduce the potential for adverse impacts on public health, safety, and welfare and the environment. So are there any on-site alterations of topography that would help? Are there any different configurations of the plan on site that would ameliorate flood risk or inundation risk? And if it's a building designated as flood design class 4, which is the highest level, that we're talking like nuclear power plants and things like that, we want there to be an investigation, not just on site, but even off site in the community to see if there's a better place for it. Now, if there's a hospital on a barrier island and it needs to be on the barrier island, then there's no other place it can go. But maybe there's a site that has less of a risk than another site. But that's the kind of interaction and interchange that we'll have with applicants. So that's the end of section 3. Any questions at this point? All right, Mr. Thomas?
I'm actually wanted to ask a question about the previous section. The example that you had provided regarding calculating the inundation risk zones mean higher high water elevation. You'd used an example from NOAA that I think was referencing like a epoch from, I think it was 83 to 2001 or 2002. And I'm curious if NOAA, I don't know if that's like if those elevations are fixed, or if it seems like likely that NOAA is going to periodically update those epochs. If we get an epoch that's 2024 date and goes back 19 years, then do we still add 5 feet to it, or is it a what's the word I'm looking for, or would it be a smaller amount just because that we start getting closer to the year 2100?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the rules don't actually speak directly to NOAA or the website. It speaks to the mean high water elevation. And I showed you a method that you can determine that through the NOAA data. If NOAA updates their data, then you would use their updated data and you would still add 5 feet to it. Because if we believe that the mean high water line has now increased a bit, then that 5 feet of sea level rise should be measured against that. Now, if NOAA or FEMA starts incorporating sea level rise into their mapping or their datums, then it's different, and then we would amend the rules accordingly as necessary to address that. But for now, if NOAA were to amend it, you would still add 5 feet to it as written in the rules. All right, Mayor Weldon. Oh, I'm sorry.
How you doing, sir?
Good. Susan, I'm sorry. I
Good.
skipped right over you. I apologize. Good to see you, Mayor.
Yes. So I have a question about working waterfronts and, what would be accommodating there. Obviously, we have to be on the water. You're familiar with our township and the amount of ship repair that we have going on there. So is there anything taken into consideration on those?
Well, absolutely. There's nothing in the inundation risk zone standards that are prohibitive, right? So if there's an existing use or if there's a new use that's being proposed, and especially if it's something that's water dependent, then that's appropriate for that area. The standards and the rules speak about how to best ameliorate flood damage and inundation and how to best design it. But as you'll see in some upcoming slides, there's only so much you can do, right? You're not going to be able to raise the marina 5 feet or 10 feet, right? You're not going to be able to raise all the You're not going to be able to raise all the roads in your community that much. But like I've talked about, there might be situations where you are doing some improvements and a road that's being inundated even now regularly, you might be able to raise up a foot or two and buy some time, right? So I think it's going to be that iterative approach to a lot of this, and I think it's something that the DEP and the local governments are going to have to work very closely on. But as you can see, we did take into account a lot of things that you had told us before, like for example, the inundation risk zone standards not applying to structures that are not being increased. That really hit home that you could have a building that you're just doing minor improvements to that are just necessary for the upkeep of the building, and that shouldn't have to trigger this whole analysis because it's an existing use. So that would still apply to things like marinas and everything else too.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Susan, I apologize. I skipped over.
Hi, no problem. My questions are really tied to the impacts of a development or redevelopment on a neighborhood or adjacent buildings. So my first question is, when you mention lifting the ground plane, getting a little extra elevation, I mean, a lot of zoning codes don't allow that because there are negative impacts on neighbors, for instance, when somebody changes the topography. So that's the first point or question in that category is how do we prevent unintended, consequences or making the problem worse for other property owners. The other one is if commercial property is exempt, then does that lose the opportunity for redevelopment of commercial property to actually improve conditions in a neighborhood rather than exacerbate them? And then the third point would be, you know, is there any consideration for once we're lifting buildings, which I've spent about 10 years doing, you know, in architecture practice previously, isn't there a missed opportunity if we don't start to increase pervious cover under the buildings that are lifted, as opposed to continuing the sort of paving, if you will, or what I call a kind of, you know, popping basements up onto ground level with concrete instead of allowing floodwater to move a little more freely. So I'm sorry if that was a complicated question, but it's about redevelopment and commercial exemptions, what to do with the ground plane when you lift, and the issues of actually altering the elevation of one thing versus another.
Yeah, no, those are great points that you raised. So I also share your concern. We wouldn't want what I would call baseball mound construction. I've seen this happen in floodplains before, where you have these little lumps of lands that are raised up and a structure is put on top of it. And then so you have this configuration of that. And that can, as you know, seriously impair the natural drainage of the area. So the rules address that, and you can't do anything on a site. If you do raise the topography, you can't do anything on site that would adversely impact the offsite, the drainage to an offsite property. That being said, though, you know, in most cases, if a building is being placed on a site, usually there's going to be some grade elevation, as you know, just to have the drainage from the building just kind of leave the building itself and whatnot. So, you know, if you're building a house, usually you're going to raise up the ground a little bit. So I have some diagrams that show what that looks like. As far as commercial development, I think your point was that since the inundation risk zone standards don't apply to commercial development, are we missing out on an opportunity to kind of make things better? And so when you look at the standards, which we'll go over shortly for the floodplain at large, and you look at how development will look like based on the FEMA +5, which we'll talk about, then you have a better understanding of like what kind of impact that has on development. And so the inundation risk zone is looking at this very specific slice of where people are living, where people are maybe are occupying during a flood, like a shelter, things like that, as opposed to the overall floodplain itself. So let me get to those standards, and then if I haven't addressed your question, you can remind me and we'll go back to that. And I don't recall what your third one was.
The third one was, why aren't we looking at what happens under the buildings that are being lifted, where that could actually help distribute or dissipate floodwater more quickly, rather than fortifying the footprint under a lifted building?
Yeah, I think I need to think about that one a bit. I think I haven't considered that too much. You're thinking about the impact that not raising the ground would be under the building? I'm not sure that I follow exactly.
So I think because after Sandy, you know, we were lifting buildings, but we lost the opportunity for that pervious surface to continue under a building, as opposed to, you know, in other words, instead of a three-dimensional approach, it still remained in the two-dimensional world, despite the fact that we're lifting. And we saw the movement of water, and we saw less damage in places where water could flow and travel horizontally and then disappear quickly. And the way things have been rebuilt, that is not even, it's gotten worse, not better, after lifting, because of the way the land under the buildings has been treated and heavily constructed.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to think on that, and I'd like to have an offline conversation with you about that.
Sure.
Because I think sounds like a great topic to explore.
Okay.
Cool.
Vince, I just want to let you and the audience know that we're coming up on 30 minutes left. So.
Okay, thank you.
And we do have a hard stop.
Thank you, Katie. All right, so let's get back to the presentation. So current sea level, mean high water line, as we mentioned, that's your current shoreline. If you add 5 feet to that, you get your future shoreline. That land in between is the inundation risk zone. And you have your current flood hazard area limit. But if you're adding 5 feet to your baseline, to mean high water line, then your flood elevation is going to go up by at least 5 feet. So what does that look like? Well, currently, we estimated that about 16% of New Jersey lies in a FEMA mapped floodplain, and part of that's tidal and part of that's fluvial. And in the coastal zone, our regulatory flood under the existing rules is equal to FEMA's 100-year flood elevation, the 1% or the BFE. When we use flood elevations in the flood hazard rules or the coastal zone management rules, we always use the higher of effective map or any newer preliminary or proposed map. If the effective map is 10 and a newer preliminary map is 11, we're using 11. That would become what we consider the regulatory flood. And we have 1 foot of freeboard added for roads and buildings on top of that. So it would be BFE plus 1 would be the lowest floor of buildings, for example. Proposed, we estimate that by expanding, by raising the flood elevation 5 feet and expanding it inland to reflect what sea level rise would do to the floodplain, that would add about 1.5% more of New Jersey's land area into the regulatory floodplain. So 16% becomes 17.5%. And that new coastal flood elevation would be equal to FEMA's BFE, effective or preliminary, plus 5, and then again, plus 1 foot of freeboard. So let's look at what this looks like in specific cases. This is a branch off the Navesink River that we looked at before. And in the same GeoWeb application, you can see that you not only can look at your sea level rise, but you can also, if you click on this tidal climate adjusted flood elevation or the CAFE, you can see what the expansion of the regulatory area is because of sea level rise. So in this drawing, dark blue represents the AE zone, and the orange that's around it is what happens when you add 5 feet to the elevation and expands landward. This is probably even a better example. This is down by Seabright again, and you can see this is the sea level rise, just as a kind of a benchmark, and then this is what adding 5 feet to the flood elevation looks like. So FEMA mapped areas, AE zone, that's the blue. The orange that's next to it is what would be added if you add 5 feet to the flood elevation. So any questions on what that looks like? Actually, I'm going to take that back. I'm going to skip this question and I'm going to go to the next one because that was such a short session, and I want to try to move on and talk about some of the implications because I think it's going to answer some of the folks' questions. So the lowest floor requirements obviously are affected by this, right? For residential and critical buildings, the floor surface has to be at CAFE plus 1. So if your flood elevation if your effective is 10 and your preliminary is 11, then that means your design flood is 11 plus 5. The CAFE is 16, and that means the lowest floor would have to be at 17. If you're in a coastal AE or V zone, then the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member has to be at or above 1 foot above the climate adjusted flood elevation. And there's some flexibility for certain AE structures in the coastal AE zone. And just as a reminder, this is a drawing that I borrowed from our friends at FEMA that shows kind of a cross section of the coastal floodplain. On the left side, you can see the V zone. That's where above the still water elevation, you have at least 3 feet of waves. And so you have a lot of lateral forces that are on buildings and loads that are on buildings. The coastal AE zone is where you have between 1.5 and 3 feet of wave height. And then and then you see the limit of moderate wave action. That's the LIMWA. And then on the other side of that is just a regular old AE zone, which has less than 1.5 feet of wave action on top of it. So other buildings, commercial, industrial, things that aren't residential or critical, they can be elevated or floodproofed or both, right? And usually it's going to be some kind of combination. This is not how you dry floodproof a building. Habitable areas have to be dry floodproof. This is not a good example of that. I want to point out that the name of the store is Storm Brothers. I don't know if that has anything to do with what happened there. But dry floodproofed areas are designed to keep water out of the building. And enclosed areas below the lowest floor can be wet floodproof, like a crawl space with flood vents. And again, you're not going to be able to have enclosures in a V zone. But the idea is to allow water to enter the building and balance hydrostatic pressure. And so I don't recommend elevating a house in this manner. I don't know that structure will be able to handle the lateral loads, but you can see what an elevated structure looks like. For all buildings, no permanent enclosures below CAFE plus 1 and VE zones. Some exceptions, but the same thing in coastal A zones. because of that wave action. And habitable areas cannot be wet flood proofed. They have to be dry flood proofed. So we can't have situations where areas are, the water's coming into areas where people are residing. And the area beneath the lowest floor can only be used for parking, building access, and limited storage. So what does this look like for a particular project? Here's your inundation risk zone. Here's your 5 feet of anticipated sea level rise. And if that's all we had to contend with, maybe the property looks like this, raising up the ground a little bit, putting the building on a crawl space, we're good. But we don't have only that to contend with. We have the flood elevations to contend with. So your current 1% flood elevation or 100-year flood elevation, and your future 100-year flood elevation, which is 5 feet higher. So if this structure were being built today, it would have to be 1 foot above the climate adjusted flood elevation. And so, as I mentioned before, in this case, let's say this is in a AE zone, the walking surface of the floor would have to be at least 1 foot above that climate adjusted flood elevation. Now, not necessarily hard to do if you're building new, especially if it's a single family home or duplex. It's not going to be the case if it's something like a commercial building, and I'll show you an example of that. Now, granted, I want to point out that this fill is very close to current sea level, and so I don't know that you'd be able to do something like this, but I can only fit so much on the drawing. So let's say that you're putting in a convenience store. Well, you're not going to be able maybe to elevate that convenience store to be 1 foot above the climate adjusted flood elevation. So you might have a combination of dry flood proofing for the area where people are going to be using the store and wet flood proofing from below it. And the dry flood proofing would have to be up to 1 foot above the climate adjusted flood elevation. So you might have a situation where the climate adjusted flood elevation is, say, 16. So that means it has to be flood proofed up to 17. Maybe the floor's at 14. So you have 3 feet of dry flood proofed area, which is generally doable. And then the area below can maybe be a crawl space. Now, it's not going to be the same if you have something like a warehouse where it's going to be on slab. That's another scenario. And you also are going to have situations where, you're not going to be able to have a building like this, because how are people going to be able to get in the door? So we recognize that there's going to have to be grading on a site to get to the building. And it is very important, as was mentioned earlier by Susan's question, that we want to make sure that any kind of on-site grading does not adversely impact off-site properties. Now, one thing I want to point out here is you can see there's a lot of fill here. And what we don't want to happen is for seawalls to be built all along our coast. So if you look in the coastal engineering rule that we're proposing to amend in the CZM rules, you can see that there's a hierarchy of stabilization methods and non-structural shore protection and storm damage reduction measures that allow for growth of vegetation must be used unless you can demonstrate that the use of non-structural methods is not feasible or practicable. So the idea is that you want a combination of rock, vegetation, things like that are more resilient and able to absorb the energy, instead of just having a seawall that can refract the wave energy and then cause greater erosion. All right, now, any questions from that session? Let's see, I missed Mayor Wilden. I don't know if your hand is up from your prior time, or if you had another question.
No, Vince, my hand.
Okay. All right, so Kaylin.
Yeah, I am just curious, like, how this might work in a more urban environment where things are built out, but say we wanted to redevelop a property, or just theoretically, like, I don't know, say in like the urban area of Atlantic City, like, how would this work where it wouldn't kill kind of a street life or continuity of a street? Like, because you can't exactly elevate everything and make a dead street, right? So I'm just curious, have you guys thought about that and what kind of solutions you could come up with for that?
Yeah, certainly. And this is designed to increase the resilience of communities and not intended to prevent things from happening, prevent redevelopment activities from happening. And so, there are so many different permutations of what that looks like. You can have situations where you're not that deep into it, and you can, by a combination of different flood proofing measures and maybe raising up the ground a bit, you can achieve that. If you're on a street that is 10 feet below the new flood elevation, you're concerned about like the storefront not, not being on the street level. There might be some cases where it's just not practicable to elevate that high, but it's really going to be a site by site basis. And so it's kind of hard to answer that in a kind of general terms. But we obviously have thought about that because our intention is not to prohibit that type of development.
Vince, if I may, I just want to answer that also from the planning perspective, right? This is the regulatory place, and really climate change is going to need to be addressed from a multiple approaches, including community planning. One of the things that we do a lot of here at DEP is to try and work with local communities to reimagine their communities with climate impacts, because as I said from the outset, we are not adopting 5 feet of sea level rise. That is what the scientists say is coming. So I think what we can do then is work very closely with the local communities through some programs that we have at the department like Resilient NJ to try and help communities really start to dig into those very questions that you're asking about, which are really important to making sure that we have communities that are resilient and that can thrive despite climate change. So I think the next question is Joe DiLorenzo. Is that right?
I think my, oh, okay. I
Oh,
think mine
Maya,
might
did
be
we
first.
skip you? I'm sorry.
Sorry, it takes a second to unmute. So yeah, thank you. Very much appreciate it. Hi, Vince. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So overall, appreciate the approach and the forward-looking elements to this. I really appreciate that you are not wanting to renegotiate the climate crisis and sea level rise and diminish your numbers based on some of the comments that we heard earlier. But that being said, of course, even though overall this is a good approach, the devil's always in the details. And there are just two things I want to ask about or point out. So when we look at the picture, when we look at your allowing fill as one of the strategies for raising the structure, I mean, just looking at it, very obviously, that's actually increasing the impervious footprint of the structure at issue, right? Because you're not going to be doing soft soils. You're not going to be doing soils that are absorbent. You're going to be doing compacted soils that can hold a structure. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, because that's a tremendous concern. We're always concerned at Delaware River Network about this, allowing any construction in these high hazard flood areas, but expanding that impervious footprint is a concern. And then just also wondering if you could speak to how the rules are really encouraging people not to build in these places and spaces, because even if you're building on stilts, you're still going to have people that are stuck in these high flood situations, very dangerous situations. And of course, you are continuing to impact the healthy nature essential for protecting the environment and protecting the communities further inland. So just wondering overall how these rules are going to help actually stop people from building in those dangerous places and spaces, and actually encourage people to accept that voluntary buyout opportunity and move away from the water's edge in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Vince. We are running out of time, so I am going to ask everyone who asks a question to limit it to one rather than the multiple series. But Vince, if you can answer those two questions.
Sure. Well, the first one's a little easier to answer than the second one. So the first one, Maya, and you bring up great points, obviously, is are we somehow by doing this encouraging the increase in impervious surface? And obviously that's not our intention here. It's a balance between recognizing that there's this increased flood risk that we have to manage, also balanced with the right that a property owner has to develop their property. And so trying to have that balance, we anticipate that there'll be a combination of elements, right? That'll be raising up the ground a bit, elevating where you can, and so on. So it's a great question, and it's kind of hard to know exactly what it's going to look like, as far as like a given site, because site configurations are all very different. But I think that what you raise is a valid point. The second one, Katie, can you remind me exactly what she said on that one? Or Maya, can you repeat that one?
Maya, I'm going to ask you to remind us.
I was
We need a
focusing
notepad,
on
Ben.
the first one.
I'm just wondering how these rules overall are going to actually
Oh.
discourage development and encourage people accepting the voluntary buyout and moving to safer ground.
You know what's interesting, Maya, is that, as Vince said from the outset, these rules are not a prohibition. So you're spot on, and they're not intended to be. I will tell you, one of the groups that we have met with is the insurance and the investment folks and stakeholders, and that's really kind of unique for us to meet with that stakeholder group. But I would like to say that not only is the impacts of climate change exerting that sort of pressure on folks, unfortunately, but I would say that the market is as well. So we're just part of what's happening here. And as I said, these rules are intended to try and get to have folks understand the risks and really to put them on notice and then work with the communities. Ben?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I just from Marsh River Township and also from the Bayshore Council down on the Delaware Bay. The question I have is kind of related to an earlier question by one of the gentlemen. That is, if the science that you're depending on from Rutgers and the others, if in 5 to 10 years they do reduce and they say, we really think 50% chance is 2 feet, and at 83% or less than 17% is now suddenly 3 feet instead of 5. Is there something in the rules that will allow that to shift back to that lower estimation that the science has made?
Ben, that's a fantastic question. We have 5 principles here at DEP, and one of them is to follow the science. So when the science changes, absolutely we change. Joe?
Okay. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
How often,
sorry, Ben.
How often? It sounds like they're updating every once in a while. From 2019 up to 2023, there was something. Is that coming every 4 or 5 years?
I don't have the right person to answer that, but I do think that's about the cadence that we're doing. And of course, we react, and we have an entire, Dr. Procopio, who spoke earlier, is the director of our Division of Science and Research, and he's got folks in his office whose entire job it is to just watch this, just like we have a chief economist who's watching the economic climate risk world too.
And I think one real quick point to mention is that every time that the data is updated, it always goes in one direction. We've never seen a drop. It's always every time it's updated, it gets worse. And that's why we want to make sure that we're high as we need to be.
Joe, thank you very much, Mr. Stoneman.
Yes, hi. One of the potential benefits of significant sea level rise is that the bays will be expanding. There'll be more bay bottom. Resources can benefit from that. Many of the properties bordering these shorelines are bulkhead, and there could be new opportunities to build, rather than hard structures of bulkheads, more living shorelines, and perhaps give some of these homeowners in existing waterfront properties the opportunities to partially, gradually, because this change isn't happening overnight, but gradually add thin films of sand, sediment, whatever, to support replacing their bulkhead with some kind of living shoreline. And will there be any possible relaxation of the rules to allow them to do that in the future, and perhaps general permits to do this, or permit by rules or something, so that you can plan long term to not necessarily lose all their property, to be able to keep some of their property, but enhance the shoreline in the way of doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a hierarchy of stabilization methods. So having the living shoreline is obviously the starting point, because we don't want people just to be putting seawalls everywhere for a variety of reasons, environmental and erosional and otherwise. I don't think that there's anything that would, in this rulemaking, that would make it difficult for people if they wanted to raise up the ground a little bit. Incrementally. I don't think that there would really be any kind of issue there. I suppose if you raised it up enough that it now requires some kind of stabilization along the bank, then that's when the rules would probably get triggered in a lot of cases.
And Vince, we do have a session that's going to address living shorelines coming up later. And I'll also mention that the idea of nature-based solutions is really on the forefront of our minds. We have an internal group that meets. We're hoping to sort of refresh some rather old materials that we've had on our website, and to do some more innovative approaches with respect to those sorts of natural systems, which let's face it, nature knows what she's doing. So so that's a great point, and stay tuned. Mr. Marunka?
My question, with the houses having to go up an additional 5 feet, is there going to be any additional laws and rules passed to have to bypass the town's zoning requirements for variances on building heights?
Yeah, that's a great question that's come up. Some folks have said to us, hey, we'd love to build a house this high, but my local zoning board won't let me because it exceeds the height limits. Or even if they do allow it, when you have a building over a certain height, you have to have different fire suppression systems in place. And, so it can change the type of construction that you have, and sometimes increase some costs. So there's a lot of nuance to that. This rulemaking we don't have the authority under this to go and force a community to accept a higher building. So it's going to happen that sometimes you're going to need variances. Interestingly, though, there is a stat in our statute there after Sandy happened. There was a provision that was added by the legislature that addressed this question for structures that are being rebuilt. So if it's something where you have a building that was damaged and it needs to be elevated because it's a substantially damaged building, then that would be covered by the statute. If it's a voluntary or new construction, then it wouldn't be covered and you'd have to get a variance on the local level. All right, we have only 11 minutes left and I've got about 18 slides. So I'm going to go through the last 18 kind of quick. Unfortunately, they're kind of technical in nature, but obviously, if there's any questions that you have, you can email them to us and we can go through them later on, because I want to be respectful for everyone's time and end as close to 2:30 as possible. So one of the things that's going to happen, because the inland flood protection rule, we added 3 feet to the FEMA's elevation, and we're adding 5 feet along the coast. There's going to be areas where tidal and fluvial floodplains are overlapping. And there are implications for how you deal with net fill, flood storage displacement, and dry access. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So what do I mean by the tidal fluvial overlap? So let's say you've got this property with a stream, and you might have you have a stream on it, so it's going to have its own floodplain, and that floodplain is going to be driven by stormwater runoff, not by the ocean. But then on top of that, you might have backwater from the bay that is inundating the whole site. And so you have a fluvial floodplain inside the tidal floodplain, and that can be complicated to figure out. Here's a profile of Flat Creek in Monmouth County that shows among other things, the 1% annual chance flood. And you can see in this drawing here, in this profile, you can see the different elevations, and you can see the area that's tidal influence from the Raritan Bay. It comes to that point, and you can see that the flood elevation is flat up until that point, and for the 100-year, and then it goes up from that point. So here is your tidal BFE, and here's your fluvial BFE, right? So we're adding 5 feet to the tidal, and we're adding 3 feet to the fluvial. Well, you have this interesting area where, right here by the confluence of the two, where it's not going to just drop down like that. You would extend that flood elevation back until it meets the FEMA +3 in the non-tidal area. So that becomes an area of tidal fluvial overlap, and your climate adjusted flood elevation is the higher of those. And this is an important point, because in that area, net fill and dry access still would apply. And in fact, you could have potential fluvial flooding even further downstream, because like that drawing showed, you can have riverine stormwater driven flooding that could cause issues, and loss of flood storage might be a problem in those areas, or dry access might be a problem, even though it's subsumed in this larger tidal floodplain. So flood storage displacement, today you have to calculate it for 2 slices of the floodplain, which I'll show you. In the proposed conditions, you have to do 3 slices. And what I mean by that is, if here is your fluvial floodplain and you have 2 slices, you have to show us that you're meeting 0% net fill for the area under the 10-year flood and then the area between the 10-year flood and the design flood elevation. Now there's going to be 3 slices between the ground and the 10 and the 100, and the 100 and the climate adjusted flood. And why this is relevant to this conversation is that you could have situations where one of these floods is tidally influenced and others aren't. So if you look in the flood hazard rules in section 11.4, there's language that we're adding that addresses this, that if one of those slices is tidal, you don't deal with net fill in that slice. But if the slice is fluvial, then you do deal with it. And so it's going to be interesting to calculate that in that area. I'm going to just go right to the end and have whatever time left we have for questions. I'm going to just talk a little bit about roadways. I have like 6 slides left. Dry access is the requirement in the rules that in certain circumstances, whether you're building certain buildings or if you have certain roadways that you're building or improving, that you need to build them so that you can get to them or from them during a flood. So people should have the ability to come and go during a flood if it's certain types of buildings, and emergency responders then can get to the building. So if it's a critical building like a hospital, school, if it's a multi-residence building, or if you're doing a residential subdivision of 2 or more homes, or if you're converting any buildings into any of these uses, then this dry access applies. And you have to have a roadway that's at least 1 foot above this climate adjusted flood elevation, getting to it. And there's some off ramps though. If you're in a tidal flood hazard area that doesn't have additional fluvial flooding, and you demonstrate that it's not feasible to raise the road, and you demonstrate and you put a deed notice on the property saying this is the minimum amount of flooding that will cause a problem for you, so that people are well informed, then you don't have to meet the standard. And this is predicated a lot on the fact that the dynamics in tidal flooding are very different than fluvial. Fluvial flooding, you can have flash flooding. It's hard to predict when it's going to happen. You could have a storm just come up and have a flood like we saw with the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida. But a tidal flood, you have some advance warning. You know when the hurricane is likely to hit. You have evacuation plans. You know what areas of your community are vulnerable. And so having that dry access in those areas is not quite as critical as is in fluvial areas. The flip side of it is, what if you're building a road? And this says, in no case shall the travel surface of a road or parking area that serves those kinds of buildings be below the 100-year unless you demonstrate that there's already a road. So let's say you have a hospital and you're rebuilding the road to the hospital or putting a new road to the hospital. You have to show that it's elevated, or that you don't need to elevate it because there's already a road. And this standard applies both to fluvial flood hazard areas as well as areas that are both tidal and fluvial, so that overlap area. And then the last few slides just dealing with roadways, because this is a concern. People have said, well, how could we possibly raise our roadways 5 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet like you're suggesting? And we know that that's not practicable in some cases, and maybe in a lot of cases. That doesn't mean that you can't raise it at all. That doesn't mean that you can't make it a little bit safer. And so we've seen time and time again where bridges are being replaced and there's an opportunity to raise up the road surface a couple feet, and so to make the road less likely to be inundated and more resilient and more able to resist the flooding. So the starting point for this and almost everything in the rule is that the structure has to be constructed 1 foot above the climate adjusted flood elevation. So the travel surface of the road or parking lot or the airport runway or taxiway or road has to be one foot above. 2 exceptions. One is that if you're a public transportation entity and you're either doing just drainage improvements or safety, state, or good repair improvements like before, or if you've been locked in with a preferred alternative on a certain date, which you'd have to demonstrate to us, then that gives you the ability to have flexibility. But then you also have to demonstrate that there would be prohibitively high construction costs to raising the road, excessive volumes of fill, design that doesn't meet transportation safety geometric design or other standards, unavoidable adverse impacts to the environment, and so on, or design that unavoidably exacerbates flooding. So the idea is that if there's a means of adding value and a way to add value, then we want to seek that. And if there isn't, then we move on to the next. And then again, just to kind of finish this topic, any kind of flexibility for travel surfaces, if that's being sought, then a PE has to certify and provide sort of supporting documentation that everything reasonable is done to get as close to the target elevation as possible, that the structure is designed to be there after the flood, be able to resist damage and displacement and loss of service, that there's no extraordinary risk posed to people, and the rules explain what that means. And the project has to meet one of the cases that we identified before. And then finally, last slide, if you do have a roadway that is below Cafe +1, then you have to have an adequate number of permanent signs posted that explain that this is what the situation is. And we've talked with our transportation partners as to what the signage should look like. But the idea is to try to communicate something more than just this side. You know, something that gives them people an idea of what kind of risk is associated with using that roadway, so they can make good choices when they're building. So that only leaves us a few minutes for questions. And sorry there was so much material to cover, but this has been recorded, so you can go back to it. And Katie, are we going to make this PowerPoint available? I think, are we going to post this on our website?
Yes, absolutely. As well as the recording.
And I know that we covered a lot of ground today, and I'm sorry I had to kind of rush near the end, but you know, we like the questions. We like hearing what you have to say about it because it helps us to improve the rule.
Okay, I see some Mr. Marunka. I don't know if that's a holdover or if your hand is meant to be raised.
That was a holdover.
Okay, all right, then we'll go to I think Mr. Weldon.
Yes, Vince, you and I spoke quite a while back about the raising the roads and the mitigation of the wetlands.
Right.
Is that considered anywhere in this rule?
Well, that's a really great question, because we wrestled with that a lot. So on one hand, you know, and what Mayor Weldon is referring to is, let's say that you have a roadway that's going through an area where it's freshwater wetlands on both sides, you know, wetlands ditches, which is pretty common, and you want to raise that road, say 2 feet, and you have your side slopes at like 3 to 1. So that means that raising the road 2 feet means bumping the fill out 6 feet on one side and 6 feet on the other side. And you can maybe tighten that up a bit, but if you have miles of roadway that you're trying to elevate and make safer, you're going to have a lot of wetlands impacts. So the rules do talk about what mitigation looks like in a changing climate, and it looks at things like, you know, what if the area is going to be in the inundation risk zone? What does mitigation look like in that area? Because if it's going to be underwater by the end of the century, you know, does mitigation make sense in that area? Maybe make sense in a different area. We can't change the ratios of mitigation. We didn't address that in this rulemaking because we have federal obligations through assumption and whatnot to make sure that our wetlands impacts are balanced. But the rule does acknowledge that this is a reason why wetlands fill could be allowed for public safety issues, and it has a discussion about the options that you have for mitigation.
I don't see any other hands. Last call as we hit 2:30.
I know we covered a lot of ground today. Sorry I had to speed up at the end, but like I said, you can go back and look at the recording. You can look at the slides that we'll post. And if you have any questions, if you're like me, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you thought, why didn't I ask this question? You can email it to Katie and myself. We'll be happy to point in the right direction.
Vince, can you just remind folks as we sign off when, you know, generally when what the next steps are for the rulemaking process?
Absolutely. So as we mentioned earlier, that we have filed the document with the Office of Administrative Law and made an advanced copy put on our website. It'll be formally published as a proposal in the New Jersey Register, we believe, in July. Office of Administrative Law is currently reviewing it, and their role is to make sure that our rulemaking, that the summary language explains all the changes that we're making and the basis and background and implications of it, and also that we're not, you know, missing something or disconnecting something somewhere. So once it's published, then there's a 90-day comment period. We will be receiving comments. We respond to every comment that we receive. The Administrative Procedures Act requires us to do that, and we need to do that because we want the rulemaking to be as good as and accurate as possible. The Inland Flood Protection Rule, which was about 1/10 the size of this rule, we received 853 comments. So I have a feeling we're going to receive some comments on this rule during that 90-day comment period, especially after our public hearings. And then what we'll do is we'll respond to every comment, and we'll adjust as necessary and as we're allowed to within the confines of the APA. You know, if somebody makes a point in the comment that something's not clear, we can clarify it. We can make some structural changes, usually clarifications, fixing typos and things like that on adoption. We can't change it on adoption from 5 feet to 6 feet to 4 feet, right? Those are things that would require a new proposal. And our anticipated adoption date is mid 2025.
All right. Thank you so much. We are at time, so I appreciate everyone attending today, and please check out the website to hear about our other 3 sessions, and we will see you there. Take care.
See you on Wednesday.